Welcome to Centennial Oral Histories, a series featuring former and current leaders of Duke University and Duke Health, sharing memories of their time at Duke and their hopes for Duke's future. Enjoy this discussion with Nan Cohan, the first woman president of Duke, who served from 1993 to 2004. She is interviewed by Peter Lang, Duke's longest-serving provost.
Welcome to the Duke Centennial Oral Histories program. Today we're going to be talking with Nan Cohan. And Nan, welcome to you.
Thank you.
Welcome back.
Thank you.
I can say back because I still live here. Let me start with the question which I think often occurs to people, which is, why did you agree to accept the presidency of Duke when you did? You were a very successful president at Wellesley, and you had options, I'm sure, including not doing it anymore. So why did you come to Duke?
Well, it's partly a question of timing. I had just finished a big capital campaign at Wellesley. I'd been there 12 years. It felt like it was time to move on. I had thought that I would go back to being a professor because I love teaching and research. I hadn't all my life wanted to be a university president, so it wasn't the necessary next step. But John Chandler, who was chair of the board, of course, came to me at Wellesley and persuaded me that this is something I should be willing to be considered for. And one of the things he talked to me about was he didn't use this phrase, but you've developed all these sort of mental muscles about being a president, and you should use them instead of necessarily going back to the library and the classroom. So I thought, well, it's worth talking. And also, I've always admired Duke. I had given a talk here invited by Ann Ferris Scott on women's leadership, which was a wonderful occasion. But I hadn't known Duke intimately. My mother actually went to Chapel Hill and loved it, so I knew the area. But I was, as a Southerner, and having gone away to college and not really come back to the South, I think it would be great to go back to what I thought of and still think of as the best university in the South, and do whatever I can to help it in its next phase. And so when they offered me the opportunity, I was very ready to say yes.
Okay, great. Well, let's talk a little bit about thinking about that next phase. So after you were here for a little while, how did you perceive Duke and what both the opportunities and the challenges would be for your presidency? I mean, as the institution as a whole.
Yeah. Well, I got the impression of people who were happy with Duke, but certainly not complacent, hungry for more, and aware that this place there's reason why Terry Sanford talked about outrageous ambitions, that Duke had and has so much potential to be an even finer university. And the interesting thing was that was true of people across the institution, and you could feel it with people in every school and people who were working in middle management or in the trenches. I mean, it was palpable. And I thought that was a wonderful sort of wave to be joining. I also got the sense, rightly, that this is a place that cares about its traditions, which I do as well. I'm an institutionalist. And I've always thought of college presidents doing different things, being founders, being fixers, or being sustainers. I would be very bad as a founder, and I'm not interested in fixing. But Duke was a place that is very strong and wanted to go to the next step. So it felt like it was the right thing for all of us as partners to do that. I guess those are the main things.
Did you see particular pressure points? I mean, let's take the freshman campus. Okay,
Yeah.
So you're thinking about how can we improve the undergraduate experience and bring it up to the level of the expectations. So talk through those kind of pressure points where you thought, well, if we make changes here, we will actually affect the culture in a very positive way.
East Campus is a perfect example because when I came, even before I took office, people said, so this is a problem you need to solve and you need to make a decision right away. Are we going to have a first-year East Campus? And I thought, I hardly know the place, and they want me to make one of the momentous decisions in its history. So I said to people, I'm not going to make that decision this year. I'm going to get to know the place better, talk with the board, the faculty, the students. And as it happened, I found that it was very controversial, which made it a harder decision because there were good arguments on both sides. But I became more and more convinced, partly on the basis of having known a couple of campuses that have freshman yards or whatever, where people really do live together, not as dramatically as a campus a mile away, but so that they get to know their classmates and have a sense of belonging rather than being lost immediately in a large or even a medium university. And I also thought that it would be a way to give people an introduction both to the intellectual life and to the broader extracurricular life of the university in sort of manageable quantities. So more and more I became convinced that it was the right answer, and went to the board in the spring saying that this was where I thought we ought to go. And I think that was right. I still am aware that there are pros and cons, but I think on balance, for first-year students, it was very fortunate to have their own campus and their own lives, as well as being part of the larger university. It's a little hard to have to take a bus to it, but that's the way we are, and it's beautiful.
Did you bump into the fraternity culture as you were thinking through that decision?
You know, it's funny, Peter. It's one thing I had not really thought about. I'd never been at an institution where fraternities were important. So to me, it was a new phenomenon. And I did begin to think about it once I was here.
Yeah, I'll bet.
But it wasn't a factor that I had thought about it in advance.
Okay. So that's one major step, okay? Another major step was when you led the Women's Initiative. So could you talk to us a little bit about how you perceived your role as a woman president, the first one at Duke, I think.
So far. First one, so
far, right? Well, the first one at the time, for sure.
Yes.
And I think probably the first one, at least at a major university in the South.
Sure, and the second in the country
Right.
after Hannah Gray.
Right. So talk about how you perceived that, the importance of that in terms of being the president of the institution.
Well, that's another very good question, and it's interesting because the Women's Initiative itself, of course, was the other bookend. East Campus at the beginning, the Women's
Right.
Initiative at the end. So one question is, why did it take so long? And that, I think, reveals a lot in answer to your question. When I came to Duke from Wellesley, I know there were a number of people. First of all, people thought I was a Yankee until I got here, and my Southern accent all came back quite naturally. It wasn't that I suddenly decided to say you
Right.
all. I mean, I just did. I was in the midst of it. And so it was very clear I wasn't a Yankee, but it was also clear I was a woman, and having a woman was a very unusual thing to do for a university like this. I felt very much supported, although I know that there were some people who thought a woman is never going to succeed at Duke. Being Duke, they were gracious and they didn't trumpet it abroad, but I knew that there were some people who were quite skeptical. Some on the board, some around, some alumni, but people were willing to give me a chance, which is all I needed. And so it ceased to be an issue fairly quickly, as far as I'm concerned. I don't know if it was an issue for other people, but it didn't bother me. Or even, I mean, the only thing I thought about during the next few years was how important it was for Duke students and junior faculty to see that a woman could be president and a woman could do the sorts of jobs that I hoped some of them might be interested in doing. But one of the things I thought about then was, what about the situation of women at Duke across the years? What is it like for them? And there I was thinking in part of the fraternity culture. I knew that the sororities were strong and they mattered to people, but they didn't do most of the big parties and they didn't set the social life in quite the same way. And so I wanted to know what life was like for women at every level of Duke. But I thought it would be bad strategically to have my first big initiative, something on the situation of women. Everybody would say, oh, well, that's obvious, you know, that's all she cares about. So that we did some research and began to track the situation of women, but we didn't do more than that. And then toward the end, when we finished that wonderful capital campaign that took most of my energy for a very good cause, and I took a deep breath and I thought, what do I want to do before I leave? That's what came back. I want to do something for women at Duke. So that's why we did the initiative at the end. And I thought it was very valuable for Duke. It was certainly valuable for some of the people I talked to. The institution of the Baldwin program, the Baldwin scholarships, I think is one of the most important legacies of my time here. Trying to introduce the values of being in a women's institution within a great co-ed institution. So those are, I mean, but in the intervening years, I didn't think about it very much at all.
Okay. The thing is, we're now touching on points that were transformational for the culture, right? I mean, East Campus, that was a cultural transformation.
Yeah.
The focus on women, that was a cultural transformation.
To some extent.
To some
but remember that the Women's College was a crucial part of Duke's
Right.
history.
But bringing that back, I think.
Yeah. Okay. It was more sort of reformation rather than a transformation.
Okay, fine.
Yeah.
Can we talk a little bit about athletics? Because that would be another touch point.
If we didn't, we would be having an odd interview.
We have two of those topics, one of which is athletics.
Okay.
So talk about the place you saw for athletics, the way you thought it was affecting the culture, and whether there were changes that need to be made there. And I do remember one particular project we had together in that regard.
Well, it became very clear to me when I got here, if it hadn't been before, that athletics were foundational to Duke, very central. And I had come from a place like, Wellesley in Division III was a competitive and good place, but it's nothing like Duke. Mm-hmm. So that to me was one of the things that was most different. That, by the way, and having deans of every school, because at Wellesley everybody was supposed to be part of the same shooting match. And also the medical center, which was so important to Duke and so huge. We'd had nothing like that at Wellesley. So athletics and having all the deans and having a big medical center were the main differences from Wellesley. People always assume it was co-ed, but it didn't make that much difference. So the athletics was one of the big differences, and I felt I had to get to know how and why it was so important. So it became very important to get to know Coach K from the beginning, because he was so... He was and has always been and will be so significant to Duke. Mm-hmm. I remember when I came to Duke, shortly after I was named president, but before I took office, we went to Cameron for the first time. Mm-hmm. And we were at a basketball game where we were playing, I think it was Iowa. And we'd had a good season, but not a great season. But we had not ever lost to a non-conference team in Cameron, or some statistic that. So we were losing to Iowa at halftime, and people literally came up to me at intermission at halftime and said, "If we lose to Iowa tonight, everybody will think it's your fault." And I thought, what? This is now a part of my job. Fortunately, we won, but. I'll never forget that. That was a way of understanding how important it was. I found Coach K a really very valuable partner. When we started out, I thought, okay, he's over there in athletics, which is important. I get to know that. But Mike wanted very much to be part of what the university does to shape student athletes, to make sure that the athlete part as well as the student part, which he cares about, were being put forward appropriately. And so as I got to know that and got to realize how valuable his judgment is and how wise he is, mm-hmm. he became part of councils and conversations that were really important to me. And I remember once, I'll never forget this piece of advice, when I was in the middle of one of the brouhahas, one of the things that we had to take on. Mm-hmm. And I was sort of charging out ahead, and Mike said to me, good generals don't always have to be right out in front. And I thought, he's right. But anyway, athletics in general, football at that time was not nearly as good as it is today.
Right.
And football was a very different issue from basketball. We loved Cameron. And I remember people would ask, do you have to go to all the games? And I thought, what are you talking about? Sitting in the president's seats. And, anyway, football at that point was very different. And we had, instead of the lovely current president's box, we had a concrete bunker where people had to come. You remember it, right? And often we were losing, and at halftime it would be pretty difficult. I still loved Duke football, and I do today, but it's a lot nicer when you win more often. And the rest of the sports I enjoyed, and it's important to remember them. The women's sports, for example, have all been important to Duke. So knowing why and how the situation of being a true student athlete and scholar athlete was being instantiated at Duke, and genuinely, I think, was one of the most important and rewarding things I learned.
Did you think that in the image of Duke that was projected externally, athletics played too large a role? We did have a project, I don't know if you remember, rethinking the admissions materials, for instance.
Yes. Well, I remember when somebody at Duke did a study that showed that the least courteous and the least warm city in the country was Philadelphia, the city of brotherly love, and that was published, and it got a lot of attention. The mayor of Philadelphia was quoted, or maybe not he, but someone in his office was quoted as saying, Duke, that's a basketball school. They have classes and stuff. So I knew that the reputation was very much, for some people, centered on basketball. I didn't worry about that. Our basketball team deserved that reputation, but I was also, you and I both, as a partnership, very much involved in making sure that the equally or strongly meritorious part of the university and academics received equal recognition outside the university, and in the circles where it was appropriate was more the first thing people thought of, and not Duke athletics.
Right.
So,
okay, good. If we talk about, you just raised the issue of the intellectual life of the university. Did you see things there where you thought, where you thought you could play a role in improving, in helping to raise the intellectual level, both for students in terms of what they were being taught and what they were learning, and in terms of the quality of the faculty?
well, the quality of the faculty was more your job, and you did a great job. No, seriously, you did a great job with it. In terms of my own perception, instead of thinking abstractly, what can we do to make the experience of the students better, I found myself thinking of particular enhancements that were often suggested by people who had some ideas in mind that might not have occurred to me. For example, better connections between faculty and students outside the classroom, sort of intergenerational connections, faculty, graduate students, undergraduates. And that's that gave rise to the University Scholars. But Melinda French Gates was very interested in that and made it possible. So it was more each project that I got involved in was a way of enhancing specific things about the education. Robertson Scholars, for example,
Right.
with Julian Robertson, was about having people have an opportunity to take advantage of this great university 12 miles away, instead of having it be only about athletic rivalry. We once joked that it was like the Montagues and the Capulets fighting in the streets, but having a thriving law firm on the side.
Right.
And I thought it was very important, partly because my mother and my daughter-in-law had gone to Carolina. And so having that opportunity to have some access, particularly for graduate students and faculty, to the resources on the other side without having to drive and park. But also for the undergraduates, fundamentally, to have some sense of deep involvement in both great universities and feel attached to both, and having a cohort of people who had that experience. So that was another way in which we could enhance, particularly for some of the Baldwin Scholars was
Right.
another. The Bass professorships was a way of, as you well recall, of making it clear that Duke believed that research and teaching are both important
Right.
to find professorships, because there has to be emphasis on research if you're a proper research university, and there should be. But teaching is so important to Duke as an undergraduate-focused institution for so much of its life. And the problem is people think, well, you can do one or the other, but you can't do both. And I knew that that was wrong. I know that it's hard to be both good at teaching and at research, but I've known people who are, and I thought it was crucial to recognize that. The Bass professorships, therefore, were a way of saying, yes, you can be excellent at both, and we have people who are, and here they are.
And we value them.
And we value them very much.
Right.
The Kenan Institute was similar, John Hope Franklin Institute. In each instance, it was part of the institution that was dedicated to enhancing some parts of the education, which I thought could be strengthened.
Right. And by doing that, I think you were elevating the whole academic side in the broad understanding of it.
I hope we did
Yeah,
that.
I think we did.
Yeah, I think we did that.
So we haven't discussed the health system. So you came, you did not, you were a political philosopher, you had taught at a women's college in Northeast.
Right.
And you arrive on this campus and half of the budget is over there.
More than half.
Well, at that time more than,
Yeah,
still more than half, was over there. So talk to us a little bit about your experience with the health system, with learning that, and then with finding the right balance across the university.
Well, it's interesting you use the phrase over there, which is certainly true at one level, but it was important to Duke through its history, I think, that in fact the first entrance to the medical school was on the main campus. So it felt it was designed specifically to feel that it was all part of the same university, even if there was this enormous medical complex behind it. And that struck me from the beginning. I remember one of the things that I did on my tours before I was actually in office was to go over to the medical center, and Ralph Snyderman sort of took me around to show me things. And I remember standing on a little stand at the head of a bed where somebody was having open heart surgery. And I was properly sort of, put in scrubs and able to watch it. I thought, wow, this is just one instance of what this great center is doing. And I was in awe of what it meant to do something like that. I now have 2 granddaughters who are doctors, and I think I have a little better sense of what that means because of my Duke experience. It is rightly, along with athletics, one of the things Duke is known for, particularly in this area where Duke Hospital is just the coin of the realm. And I became aware of that, and I wanted to make sure that we supported that. The hospital and the whole medical complex has a strong sense of itself as having its own rules and its own world, and we all had to wrestle with, so what does that mean? Not to try to treat it as though the medical center was just like, the English department, another wonderful part of Duke. And I had to learn that. But I also wanted to be sure that the medical center remembered that they are part of Duke and that we're very proud of what they're doing, but we are all part of the same enterprise. I remember when somebody asked me what it felt like to be the captain of such a big ship. I said, it's not a big ship. They said, it's very hard to move such a big ship around, isn't it? I said, well, I don't think it is a big ship. It's a flotilla. And I'm the admiral at this point, and I'm supposed to make sure that all the ships are moving roughly in the same direction and that we all get there at the same time.
Right, good. With regard to leadership, okay, so one of the roles of the president is to pick leaders, and I could enumerate a number of leadership choices that you made that had a big impact on the institution. We could talk about the museum, we could talk about the Keenan Ethics Program, we could talk about the executive vice president's role, we could even talk about my role. So talk about those leadership choices and how you approached them and because they've made a huge difference. And when if you look at our peer institutions, none of them have had the strength and continuity of leadership at that level that we've had at Duke.
Well, I certainly agree with you that that's an important part of the president's job, more than I had realized, actually, before I took office, because I had never been a dean or a provost or anything, so I really had never managed anything. But learning how crucial the key roles are and how crucial it is that a team work together were some of the things that were most important in my first years. Well, recruiting you to be provost was one of them, Peter, and so we should start talking about that. No, we should, because you've been so important to this place, and you and I have always been in sync in a very fundamental way, but have real differences too, in which we strengthen each other. And I remember when I said I wanted to choose you as the provost, and people said, well, you can't have 2 political scientists. And I said, look, political science is a very diverse discipline. I study Rousseau. You know, Peter's a comparative politics person. We're doing very different things. And that didn't matter at all. The difference was the way we thought about Duke, the strengths we brought to our conversations. And so your leadership in the academic world here has been just phenomenal. And I think it was wonderful that you decided to say yes.
Well, it wasn't a hard choice.
Appointing Tallman was equally important. Because the university's buildings and its campus and the people in the administrative side are so important to the success of this place. Recruiting Tallman was not as easy as recruiting you, partly because he had a very good job out on the West Coast and initially was not interested. But after we interviewed somebody from Stanford who we thought might be a good VP, but I was still very intrigued by Tallman. I took him to the top of the Pickle, whatever that building is in between Chapel Hill and Duke, and I showed him around so proudly. And he looked around and he said, "There sure are a lot of trees." And I thought, wow, if he thinks that, he's not going to be real happy at Duke. And fortunately, in the end, that didn't work out. And then Tallman was available. And his understanding of what it means to build buildings. People always say Tallman was an architect who didn't quite get the license, but does it anyway, and always loved it. Working with Tallman was always a very good experience because we both enjoy very much what it means to design and build and live in a building. So that was very important to the university as well. But there were also really, great. Myrna Adams was a great appointment.
Right.
We had such an important sense of what it really means to work for what's now called diversity, equity, and inclusion. But we did it, I think, much more sensitively because of Myrna and Larry Moneta. And there's a whole long list, but certainly recruitment was very important.
Right. I wanted to come back to that kind of issue with respect to the Nasher Museum, because the Nasher Museum was something which you just stuck with for years through a lot of obstacles, and eventually were able to bring it, which was another one of those points at which Duke was saying something new about itself. So talk a little bit about the whole.
Well, we know a lot. We owe a lot to Ray Nasher and his family, who were willing to wait, because Ray was ready to build the museum almost as soon as I got here. But there were other priorities that we felt needed attention that were more pressing, the engineering school and others. And so we were not able to do it right away, but when we were ready, Ray was patient, was willing to wait, and so we could do it at the right time and in the right place. And I've always thought of that as one of the most enjoyable parts of my time here, was building that building. And we are very fond of art and enjoying being there as part of Duke. But the Nasher family was really wonderful about that. With the delays, they never said, "Well, we're going to take our money elsewhere." They cared a lot about Duke, Nancy especially, and so we got it done.
We did. I want to come back to the academic side. So you mentioned the deans. At different schools, the president has different relations with the deans, not just with the provost. And how did you perceive the appropriate role for you as a strong academic in your relationship to the academic enterprise overall and to the deans in particular? And then we can come back to the faculty as well.
Well, as I said, having so many deans was a different thing entirely from what it was like to be at Wellesley. And I was not sure at first exactly how that would work out. I went around and visited the deans when I got here, and I went to a meeting of the Dean's Advisory Group at Fuqua quite soon. And basically they gave me to feel like, we're Fuqua, and it doesn't matter a whole lot what Duke's doing, literally. And I thought, whoa, this is going to be an interesting challenge. And had a little bit of the same sense with the law school, but not quite so much.
Right.
And when we've talked about the medical school. So I realized that these deans had very strong and well-founded opinions about what their school ought to be doing. And part of my job was to make them aware that they were, more perhaps than they were, also part of a larger enterprise. and that they should feel that their network of ties within Duke, with other deans and with other faculty members, was an important part of their strength. And then when you came along and made the Dean's Council a really important part of the university, that was huge. And I was very glad that you invited me and encouraged me to attend the Dean's Council meetings, because that's not true on every campus.
No, it's not true on most campuses.
Exactly. And for me, those meetings were among the most important incidents of my time in the president's office, because I got to hear what the deans were concerned about. And they didn't, I mean, I very rarely spoke, or except when you asked me to make some presentation, but getting to know through those discussions what was going on in each of the schools and recognizing how you were bringing the deans together to feel, I think for the first time, at least in our experience, as part of a team, was a really important part of what I was doing at that point.
So that's an interesting observation, because a lot of times people think of the presidency as that's the external face of the university, right?
Yeah.
The president's the person who raises the money and presents the university to the public, et cetera, et cetera. And what you were just describing was a way that the president could be more, if not an ongoing daily force on the inside, at least be fully informed and a real partner, actually, to the provost also on the inside. So talk about that experience.
No, I think that's really important. I want to spend a few minutes on it, because I had been, as I said, a very deeply engaged professor at Stanford. And I was doing research on 17th and 18th century French thought, doing a lot of mucking about in archives, enjoyed teaching very much. So it was hard to leave being a professor, as I said. And I always still sort of thought of myself as a professor. I remember when I got to Wellesley, where I had been an undergraduate, some of the faculty members remembered me as an undergraduate. I think it was weird for them to have Nan Overholser back as their president. But anyway, I found that I had to understand that I was no longer a member of the faculty, even though I wanted to keep close faculty ties. So I had that preparation before I came to Duke, and that was very helpful. The faculty were very welcoming. It was very clear I was the president, and that was a different position. For me personally, it was always important to be in touch with the academic life, to feel that I knew the faculty, inviting people, newly tenured faculty, to lunch at the Duke every year. That sort of thing. It would have been very hard for me to be only external. I knew that was probably the most important part of my job on balance, but I felt very much involved internally as well. I thought that was important for Duke. I hope we're going to talk a little bit about the external part too. But the research and the teaching, having a sense of what was actually being done at Duke and how the deans were thinking about their schools was an important part of my life.
Great. So I want to move then to the relationship between the president and the board, and then the president and fundraising, basically. But let's talk a little about the relationship of the president to the board. How you perceived the board, and how the board, you thought, perceived you in your role. Duke, to me, has always had a board which was more appropriately hands-off than some boards are. That was the perception that we had on the academic side. But I'd like you to talk a little bit about your relationship to the board.
Well, the board was very important to me as president, obviously at some level. Being a member of the board and participating fully in the board discussions gave me a sense of how crucial members of the alumni body and those who were not Dukies but who cared about the university thought about it at some distance removed from the day-to-day. I became very close to several board members and found their wisdom very valuable, both individually and collectively. I knew that they were my bosses, so to speak, but I never felt like I was working for them. It was very much working together. I found the board quite supportive from the beginning. I know that, as I said, there may be some people who felt it was a little odd to have a woman president, but they didn't seem to feel that way very long. We got to be very close, and I admired a number of the board members as well as becoming friendly with them. But it was more working together to set policy and thrash out big problems, and having a group that I could respect and trust for that wisdom. One of the things that's true about Duke's board, as you know, is that there's the executive committee and then there's the larger group. And both of them were valuable. With the executive committee, 12 people, we could talk at great length and in great depth about problems and work things through before they got to the larger board. But with the larger board, there was such a wonderful variety of people with different backgrounds and different interests and perspectives. And so we also found then that there were ways of thinking about things that a smaller group wouldn't have come up with. I enjoyed very much the board retreats where we had time to get to know each other even better. I'm not sure everybody on campus really understands how important the board is to Duke, not just formally as the source of authority, but also as individuals and collectively a source of wisdom and judgment and loyal support. So I always enjoyed working very much for the Duke board. One of the things that I owe several things to my predecessors. And one of the things I owe to Keith Brody, he worked very hard to make the board a stronger board. And that's the way it felt when I got here.
Great. So fundraising.
Fundraising.
Yeah, I mean, you led the largest campaign in Duke's history, I guess the second or third largest campaign of any university.
At the time.
At the time, yeah. Yeah, it's sort of not there anymore. But, and we had not had a tremendous campaign before that, certainly not a university-wide campaign. So talk with us about the process of getting to that, setting the targets, and then hitting those targets.
Yeah. Well, on fundraising, this was something I had no experience about when I got to Wellesley, literally zero. Had sort of a little bit of uneasy anticipation, what's this going to be like, going and asking people for money. So fortunately, the head of development at Wellesley, this is relevant to your question, it sounds not, but it is.
Sure it is.
Head of development at Wellesley saw that I needed to have a good experience with my first major fundraising so that I would look forward to it rather than seeing it as an onerous task. So he sent me out to Los Angeles with one of the trustees from there to visit a woman who had been a professional golfer, which is very unusual. I'm a class of 1934. So he knew, and we knew she was interested in athletics. My job was to persuade her to give the naming gift for a field house, because when I got back to Wellesley, the gym was still the one I had had as a student, and everybody, I mean, it was 103 years old, it was a museum, and all our colleagues were building new gyms, and we just had to have a new field house. I went to Los Angeles with that intention, and on the way, I had this inspiration. Her husband had died recently, and they were very close. He had given a field house at Williams in his name. So, of course, the obvious thing was to say, we can have his and her field houses at Williams and Wellesley. So that was what I was going to say. Right. But when I got there, she said, I know you've come to ask me for money. This is the way fundraising often goes. I know you've come to ask me for money. I've decided what I want to do. I want to give a bird house, a bird house, sort of flower, a fountain with a bird in between, in front of the museum. And I said, oh, thank you very much. It's an interesting idea. But let me tell you what I've come to ask you for. So then I shifted into my request. She said yes. I went home and I said to Bob, I should have asked her for more. And then I knew I was into fundraising.
Right.
Anyway, so when I got to Duke, I had that kind of experience from Wellesley. I found then, wherever I've tried to raise money, that the important point to keep in mind, and you don't even have to tell yourself, it becomes relevant always, is these people have money. You're not asking them to give away their last dollar, and they are philanthropic, and they will give. And my job was to make sure that they gave a significant portion of it to Duke. They were people almost always who had ties to Duke, cared about Duke. And my job was to make sure that they saw how those ties might be strengthened by giving significant gifts. Duke alumni are wonderful people, and I almost always found it fascinating and enjoyable to be fundraising. It was challenging too, because you would be having a lunch at which you were supposed to be bringing up giving money, and you have to decide when and how do I do it. But I found that mostly it was a rewarding part of my job, and I got to know some wonderful people that way. So fundraising really doesn't feel like going to some people begging hand in hand. It's more a partnership. I think about Frank Keenan and the Keenan Institute, Julian Robertson and the Robertson Scholars, Melinda Gates and a number of projects. Those were real partnerships, and they were a very important and deeply significant part of the time at Duke.
Great. So one topic we haven't talked about, which I know repeatedly arose, including marching through the halls of the Allen Building, was race. And you were a Southern woman at a Southern university, and you had to deal with the race issue with a particular perspective which you brought. Can you talk about how you perceived racial issues at Duke at the time? Now we call it all DEI, but it was it was fundamentally about the relationship between Duke and the African American community in Durham, on campus, and further.
So I was indeed a Southern woman. I was raised in Arkansas and South Carolina. My father was a minister, and my mother was a Texan and not really a Southerner in that sense. They were very liberal, but they weren't fighters, but they were liberal, and they took steps, and that taught me. My father made sure to invite members of the Black Presbyterian Church in our town occasionally to worship with us, and we went and worshiped with them. So I was brought up believing that segregation was wrong in any form and that Jim Crow was a horrible stain on our country. My family hadn't been active, ardent fighters for racial justice, but they did important things in their own way. So that was the way I was brought up. And when I got to Duke, I was well aware that one of the most important things for Duke was to be seriously successful in dealing with the challenges that race brought to America. This was 1993. Still, the civil rights issues were very visible, as they are today. One of the most valuable things was discovering how many Black professionals and middle-class leaders were involved with Duke from the community and within Duke, which had not been true at Wellesley because there just weren't as many African Americans around. And since Durham is, of course, a robustly populated and led city by African Americans, that was a great advantage because there were people we could work with on race. One of the worst moments was when there was the lynching. When people came to work early one morning, you'll help me through the details here, on the bus stop on West Campus,
right.
And there was a figure of a lynched person
right.
hanging there. And it was horrible, particularly for the African American people who were coming to work early. It turned out in the end, this was a statement that was being made, and we had to deal with that, and that was a very difficult moment. But in general, I found that people on this campus were very interested in improving any racial tensions that remained. And working with people in Durham on this was one of the best parts of my job. The Duke-Durham Neighborhood Partnership, which is not just a matter of race, but race was certainly involved. I was shocked when I learned that Duke was regarded as the plantation by workers in some instances. I thought that's a horrible thing to be true. One of my main purposes was to try to dissolve that antagonism and make sure that people in Durham understood that Duke was their institution as much as it was anything else. So that was a complicated part of our job. but a really high priority one. I think the Duke-Durham Neighborhood Partnership was a very crucial step for us and for the city. And a lot has been done since I left, building on it, clearly. It's just very different from what it was when we came. So having race partly at the center of that was one of the spurs. And I think that this university has done a better job than most, even though there are still problems, there are everywhere, at tackling that.
Okay. And then you saw the neighborhood partnership partly in that context. And what else did you think was important?
I thought it was important that we were talking about neighborhoods right around our East Campus, our freshman campus. And I hadn't really realized how big that problem was until John Burness and Tom and Trask and I got into it. And one of the specific instances that I recall was the small sort of convenience store about 2 blocks from East Campus. That was a notorious site for selling drugs. Everybody seemed to know that it was a site for selling drugs, but nobody seemed to be able to do anything about it. And here we were 2 blocks from East Campus. So I think it was Tallman's idea to buy the store and turn it into a center for ministerial support for the ministers of the churches around us, which was great. It was so perfect. People come for solace, and what do they find? Not drugs, but ministers. And what I know I'm saying "and" too much, but all of it seems to fit together.
Well, I think it does fit. I mean, I think that was my point at the beginning when I talked to you about how the transformational moments.
Yeah.
It's an accumulation of small of small interventions.
One of the things I did want to say about the Duke-Durham partnership was we discovered what now seems obvious. We discovered that the neighborhood wasn't a single place. There were many neighborhoods around Duke University of people with their own their schools, their ways, their playgrounds, their leaders, their places to hang out. They each felt very much like a specific neighborhood within this larger mosaic of Durham. I at least didn't know that at the beginning. People like Bill Bell and Fail Wynn helped us so much to understand what Durham was really like. And dealing with it because there had been this sense of Durham as well, sort of, there's this big university over there, they think they know how to do anything, and when they come to us, they come to tell us what to do. Going instead and asking, how can Duke help? Not, here's what we want to bring you, but what can we do to help? And that made all the difference, because some of the things they said surprised us. They didn't all just want a lot of money. Right. They wanted help with schools, they wanted tutorials, they wanted buy out the store, whatever. So
great. All right, let's move a little bit toward the present and the future. And a lot of college presidents these days are facing the challenge of protest. And you faced the challenge of protest in various points. And from my perspective, I would say that you found a way to be both firm and tolerant. And I can still remember allowing the students to walk through the Allen building when there was the threat of occupation, and we found that. So talk a little bit about the role of the president and creating a climate on campus which is both tolerant of and firm about the nature of protest.
I'll be glad to talk about that, although I feel that I was relatively lucky in that we didn't have any protests of the profundity and force that we're looking at right now.
Yeah, well, things
were somewhat different.
Well, not only that, but I mean, the climate in which that you've created around that makes a difference to the form that the protest takes when it happens.
That's true. But I was thinking about my predecessors as well as my successors. Right. Not only specifically at Duke, but predecessors, yes, at Duke. Terry Sanford, when he came, it was in the middle of the Vietnam War protests. Right. And people were sitting out, huge numbers of people out in the main quad. And Terry Sanford stopped by and said, what are you here for? They said, we're trying to take over the Allen building. He said, I've been trying to do that for 2 weeks. Can I go with you? I mean, and the students were totally, what's this? It was perfect. And he would have been great today as well. Doug Knight, who was a wonderful guy, really had a hard time with the protests. And that's why he resigned. I I remember when I would host people at the Night House, and in the living room, sometimes alumni would tell me as we were having the cocktails, you know, when I was here occupying this building, that's where I slept. I thought, okay. So there had been much more dramatic protests before we came. The one that I remember most clearly from our time was about sweatshops.
Yeah.
And for that one, I was very sympathetic with students. I thought that it was relevant that wearing a Blue Devil sweatshirt meant that where it was manufactured had something to do with what we were like. So for that one, the protests were easily successful with me as president because I agreed with them. That's not true of all the protests, but setting limits in the sense that people understand that radically disrupting the education, destroying property, or making life difficult to impossible for some other members of the community is not acceptable, and there will be barriers and there will be consequences. We never really had to get into that because the times were different. I have a lot of sympathy for the people who are grappling with it today, but I realized that that was not, at that depth, something we had to deal with. Okay. At Wellesley, I did with the protests over divestment.
Okay.
But not at Duke.
So if we switch from the present, or the past and the present, to the future, so you have a long view of Duke now, and a long view of higher education now. And I'd love for you to reflect a little bit on what you see as both the best future for Duke and how that fits into the future for higher education.
I was thinking of my conversation with Dick Broadhead and Vincent Price last night, which was a wonderful experience for all of us. One thing I said last night I would start with in answering your question. When I came to Duke, I thought of it as being on a trajectory between being a fine regional university, a national university, and on its way to being a global university. And sort of we've been moving along that spectrum ever since. I think we are now a globally recognized university. What I hope for Duke in the future is that we continue to occupy that large spectrum as a very fine and respected institution. We also remain true to our roots. I think Duke people are rightly interested in tradition. It's one of the few places in the world where the founding family, remains deeply involved. The Duke family are having a breakfast reunion here as we celebrate the centennial. I don't know any place else that's like that. And having the sense of continuity with the past, as well as an optimistic view of the future. For me, in order to make that future truly meaningful, we must remember that we are strongly rooted in the South, that we have a certain kind of history as an institution that is different from the histories of the Northeastern Ivy Leagues or the West. Mm-hmm. And not lose that. I don't know exactly what's that going to mean. What is that going to mean in the future? But I have every belief that it will matter and that we should find ways to continue our regional distinctiveness and be faithful to our roots and our traditional obligations at the same time that we celebrate our international growing prominence. So I think for me that some sort of moving along that trajectory and finding comfortable places at each point along the way and holding on to them is the way I would think about Duke's future.
So that's interesting because I can remember a conversation you and I had a while back now about this topic. And the metaphor I used was that Duke was like a late teenager becoming a young adult.
Right.
And perhaps now it's an adult.
I think it's definitely an adult.
Adult, right?
Yeah.
But the question still becomes, as you mature,
right,
what changes as you mature? And how does a university
right,
move into maturity without becoming complacent?
That's exactly right. That's what I was going to say. The great threat of, I think of some other very fine universities, that have been threatened by complacency. They've lost their sense of hunger and ambition and desire to get even better. I hope that Duke always retains a sense of humility. We can do even better, but we need to be proud of what we are without becoming complacent. I think that's the main threat. I think Duke's far from that, but someday it may be a threat.
Yeah. Well, this is great. Are there things you'd like to add about your experience or about how you think about Duke these days?
Well, I would simply emphasize how wonderful the people are and were. Getting to know students, getting to know faculty members and the administrative team and the board and townspeople who worked with us. I have always been struck, and coming back to Duke now for this celebration, I'm struck once again how pleasant people are. Even though people are not all sort of mealy-mouthed or anything, but people say hello to you, people greet you. This is not so true in Boston or New York. And it just feels good to be in a place where people feel warm enough to each other or courteous enough to each other to make you feel welcome. I also think about the ways in which Duke's academic prominence has continued to infuse the rest of what we do, and I hope that will always be true. That it won't get lost in a feeling that we must also be, high with tech transfer and other things that we do. That's important, but what happens in the classroom, what happens in the libraries and the laboratories, is so central to what we do, and I don't want to think that we might ever lose sight of that in getting caught up in other aspects of Duke's prominence today. You've asked so many good questions. I don't really have anything else that I would add except pride and humility in having been part of this place and a sense of its very special nature, which really hits you coming back.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for spending the time with us. I think this has been great.
Thank you,
And
Peter.
I think will be enlightening for those who see it. So thank you.
Thank you, Peter.